Test, 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 test.
Good evening. Welcome. Welcome to Pequot Library. Look at this turnout. We are thrilled. How's everyone doing? Great to see you all. Welcome to Pequot Library. I'm Stephanie Coakley, the Executive Director of the library, and we are delighted to see all of you, and a special big welcome to those of you who may not have been here before. I know we have a lot of fans of Lian's writing in the audience and her great podcast. We're just thrilled to see you all this evening. So welcome, welcome. Lian is the author of 4 best-selling novels, and tonight we are pleased to host her for a talk about her latest book, Lost and Found in Paris, published in 2022 by William Morrow. Her other books include The Sweeney Sisters, Helen of Pasadena, and Elizabeth, the First Wife. She's written for O, the Oprah magazine, and Working Mother magazine. She's the producer and host of the award-winning podcast, Satellite Sisters, that she created and runs with her sisters. Returning to her hometown of Southport from her home in Pasadena, we are so honored to host Lian for tonight's talk. And we couldn't have done any of this preparation and planning of tonight's successful event without the faithful commitment of our volunteer Meet the Author Committee. I'd like to recognize their work this evening. Thank you so much. And especially to our neighbor and new board member, Libby Trischler, for her kind generosity in supporting this evening's program. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to the Pequot Library stage to Lian Dolan.
Stephanie is much taller than me. Yay! Pequot Library stage. All right. I am so thrilled to be here. Let me get this settled. Who's going to donate a new mic for next time I'm here? Can we do a live auction for that right now? I am so thrilled to be here. There's a special pleasure and terror in coming back to your hometown library when you are an author. And I think some of the most terrifying nights of my life were spent in this room. I'm talking about dancing school. It's just a flashback when you walk in here, like, are we going to have to go through that receiving line? Is it, hello, Mrs. Perry, my name is Lian Dolan, and this is my partner, Eddie Bryan. Like, it just takes me right back here. And the terror didn't end because my mother, I was the youngest of 8 kids, as many of you know. And I'm sure the library still has overdue fines from the Dolan family, no doubt. But we lived on the corner of Center and Harbor. And, my mom's not driving that. There's no pickup there. The corner Center and Harbor. So I used to have to just run down Center Street at the end of dancing school, which was the darkest street in America. And halfway down, there's that terrifying Victorian house that was painted like a sea green or a pea green, just very threatening. And my older brothers, the house was owned by the Rugers at the time, and my older brothers swore to me that old lady Ruger sat in the window with a big gun and would shoot him. I was so terrified running down that street. And I think we all know you don't get a lot of traction in patent leather shoes. It's just not good. So I was always grateful to come to dancing school, survive, and get home. But it is a real thrill. Thanks to Southport, to Pequot Library for having me. It's a pleasure to come back to Southport. I did have to cancel in the spring because of COVID, and that was terrible. So to accommodate me now, I appreciate it. To Stephanie and Grace and Caroline, who's no longer here, but the whole staff here, I really do appreciate it. I'm asked all the time when I speak about, oh, my son wants to be a writer, my daughter wants to be a writer, what advice do you have for them? And I usually say, read everything you can, watch everything you can, have some adventures, and then just spend a lot of time in hotel bars, eavesdropping on people. And that's really a recipe for success. But truthfully, I wish I could tell people you should grow up in Southport, Connecticut, because that is a great place for writers. I think about what made me sort of the writer I am and the person I am. And it really starts here. Every writer is a reader. And this is where I started reading. My bus stop for Oakville was right across the street there. I spent a lot of afternoons here reading, being terrified, of course, by Stanley Crane. Rest in peace, rest in peace. And but I felt like the key word for me growing up was just access. I had access to an unbelievable library, an unbelievable collections here, and just a community that supported books and writers. I had access to fantastic public education in Fairfield. I was happy to go to the schools I did, and in every school along the way, I had teachers that said to me, "You can write. You should be a writer." My sixth grade teacher, Mrs. Olson, Miss Kinsella was my English teacher in middle school. She was hugely influential. Miss Bonna at Roger Ludlow was someone that pulled me aside, when I was just a sophomore and said, "You should read and write more." And we designed a lot of independent studies around that. And so I was grateful for that access to fantastic public education. And then at Southport, you're this close. We had access to so many great cultural and arts things. And I'm glad that my parents encouraged that. They didn't drive us there, but let's be clear, there was no rides to anything. But if we could get on public transportation, we could go. I'm looking at Sheila Leahy. I guess she has a new last name now. It's Duffy. But Sheila Leahy and I, do you remember when we took the train in and waited in line to see Shakespeare in the park? And, we saw Rex Smith. Remember that? That was great. But even the Shakespearean Theater, in Stratford was such a resource. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, Broadway. I saw a million music shows. A lot of my concert buddies are here. You know who you are. Let's keep it between us. And that Jackson Brown show, let's keep it between us. But I just feel like I had access to so many cultural events, and all of that sort of feeds into my writing. Even today, the stuff I enjoy writing about is the stuff I enjoyed doing and I did when I was younger. Again, I'm super happy to my parents, and we had a family that really believed in all of that stuff, which was good because none of us could do math. And so I guess it would have been helpful if one of us could do math, but seeing none of us could do math, the fact that it was okay that I was a classics major and philosophy majors and English majors and history majors, like that was cool with them. And all of that sort of factors into the work I do now. But I think Southport is a fantastic place to grow up if you want to be a writer. So that's my advice to you. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book that's out now, Lost and Found in Paris, and tell you how I put that together. And it incorporates a lot of the things I just said. It's what I like to call an art history treasure hunt, right? So that happens in Paris. And it was supposed to be the third book of a series. It is the third book of a series. When I first started writing fiction, I didn't start till I was 45. And I like to say that because there are usually writers in the audience and they're thinking maybe their time has passed, but it's not too late. I had written lots of other stuff before then, but I didn't actually write my first sentence of fiction prose till I was in my 40s. I had been hosting Satellite Sisters for ABC Radio. It was a nationally syndicated show, and we were on the air 6 days a week, 3 hours a day of live radio. So I was busy. I didn't really have time to write fiction. But then guess what? We lost our job. And I found unemployment really freed up my time. I just had so much time. And so the first month, I put on my red sweatpants and I watched Sweet Home Alabama like 80 times. And then I thought I should really do something more than this. What would Reese Witherspoon do? And so I signed up for an online novel writing class at the time. That was in 2009. And that was sort of new. That wasn't really a thing then. We just met and we over Google Chats and we just exchanged documents and papers. And within a year, I had my first book, Helen of Pasadena. But I conceived it, with just supreme confidence as a 3-book series. Even though I'd never written a single book, I was like, I'm just going to write 3 books now that I have all this free time. And I wanted to write books about contemporary women being inspired by historical women, because that was something that had happened to me. I always enjoyed, reading history and learning about history and identifying with women of history. And I thought there was a niche in the market for that. And I thought there was particularly a niche if it was contemporary and funny and had, just a touch of satire and a tone where you could laugh at yourself. So my first book was Helen of Pasadena. It was a book about a woman who found herself at age 40, suddenly widowed, broke, and having to reinvent her life after her cheating, lying husband is run over by a Rose Parade float. So there's the tone. There's some archaeology in there. The second book is Elizabeth, the First Wife, and that is a book about a woman whose now famous husband comes back, and she's a Shakespeare professor. And they go to Ashland, Oregon, and they stage an avant-garde production of A Midsummer Night's Dream at the Shakespeare Festival there. But I can trace that right back to Miss Kinsella's English class and going to the Stratford Theater here, which is extraordinary. And this book, Lost and Found in Paris, was originally called Joan of Art. And we changed the title to Lost and Found in Paris because, as my agent said, don't be an idiot. Put Paris in the title. And that is what you pay them 15% for, that kind of advice. So, but I thought by the third book, I'm probably ready to write a book about Paris. I'll probably be a good enough writer, and I'd like to go to Paris eventually, because I haven't in years. And I thought too that I wanted just to take a look at art. I had already used archaeology and history, and I thought art would be a fun world. Now, all of my books are currently starred in Pasadena, which has been my hometown for 30 years, and they think super highly of themselves. I think you'd all enjoy it there. It's very, like when I first moved there and people were so snobby, they didn't talk to me. I'm like, I'm from Southport, Connecticut. What do you mean you're snobby and you're not going to talk to me? Don't you know I went to dancing school at the Pequot Library? We have dancing school in Pasadena too. I made my sons go. And so I thought it would be fun to write about art. And then there was a couple of beautiful museums in Pasadena, the Norton Simon and the Huntington, incredible resources there. And then I realized I don't really know that much about art. So I really had to do a deep dive. But I thought if I could work, art was a theme. I wanted to explore the art world. That would get me to Paris. The other theme I wanted to take a look at was fame. And I think when you live in Los Angeles area long enough, you sort of get used to fame. You just, when you walk into a room that people are looking at you and then they're looking over your shoulder to see if anyone better is coming in the door. And you're just around enough famous people that you sort of start to take them for granted. And then you realize they're very famous and that fame gives them tremendous access and tremendous wealth. And my kids went to school with the children of some famous people. And I thought, that must be weird, to be the child of famous people and be at things like the Academy Awards when you're 11. That seems wrong. So I thought, okay, I'd like to take a look at fame. And the third thing I wanted to take a look at, because I do like to layer something a little bit darker and heavier. And, these are books about contemporary women and their lives, and we have a lot going on in our lives. So the third thing I wanted to take a look at was loss, what that means to lose somebody and recover. So I always start every book by putting together the character, and that's essentially what most novelists do. It's the best part of the book to me, creating the main character and then the other major characters and the side characters. And I spend a lot of time on that. And I usually write like a 4 or 5 page character sketch for each main character before I even start working on the plot pieces, because the best works of fiction are when you follow characters that have something has happened in their life and they can't go back to where they were before, right? Like some major change has happened and you're on the journey with them, but there's no going back. And so you have to figure out who they are before you have to figure out what happens to them. So I created this character of Joan. I wanted to use Joan of Arc as the historical inspiration. So I created this character of Joan. She's a curator at a small museum in Pasadena. She is the daughter of 2 very famous people. Wants to take a look at fame. Her father is a light and space artist. And I had to learn about light and space, so now you do too. That's a movement that started in the 60s, heavily in Southern California. And I was inspired by the light and space artist, James Turrell. We happen to go to the same school, Pomona College in Claremont, California. So I had the opportunity to see him recreate a bunch of his artwork when I was there, and then hear him speak in a really intimate conversation on alumni weekend. And I was like, okay, check. He's the inspiration for the father. And then for the mother, I picked a supermodel, because that's the fun part of fiction, right? Why not? They could be supermodels. That's great. And remember that time in the 70s when all those really beautiful women, got together with all those super unattractive men, think about like Christy Brinkley and Billy Joel. Like, whoa, that's a lucky guy from Long Island. I'll tell you that. So, but I wanted to go kind of old school model, because nowadays models, they want to be role models and they want to be the CEOs of wellness companies and tell us how to live our lives, but not in the 70s. That was like coffee, cocaine, and cigarettes, and like they were like 100 feet tall and they looked fantastic. So those are the parents I gave Joan. Her father was a sort of a very famous artist, and her mother was a supermodel. And then I had to get Joan to Paris. I had to figure out, okay, if I want this book to be about art and I want her to get to Paris, how am I going to do that? And I always say you just really never know where the inspiration for your next book is going to come from. At my dad's funeral is how I figured out what Joan was going to be. When my dad died, we had a great funeral here. It was great. I'm sorry you couldn't all make it, but it was great. And afterwards, we were just sitting around, and I was talking to my nephew's wife, and she had just started a job at the Guggenheim in New York as a curator. And I said, Lauren, what's the best part of your job? And she said, well, I get to take the paintings, from the Guggenheim in New York to like the Guggenheim in Venice or the Guggenheim in Las Vegas or Bilbao. I was like, what is that? She's like, I'm an art courier. And my head exploded because I was like, so problem solved. I was like, what is Joan going to do? She's going to be an art courier. I didn't even know that job existed. And I was like, how is there not already a series of books or a television show about art couriers? So I went home and I did the very heavy research. I Googled what is an art courier, and believe it or not, there's some Wikipedia pages on that. You can take a class on how to be an art courier. And then I started, following the Google down, and there was an article a couple articles from the New York Post. Oh, so it's going to be good. So I clicked through to one, and it was the story of an art courier in New York. There are private art couriers, and this guy was just transporting a painting from the east side to the west side. That's all he had to do. But sure enough, he ran into his ex-boyfriend on the way, and they sat and had lunch, and then he drank too much, and then he got in the cab, and then he forgot to take the painting out of the cab, and the cab disappeared. All right. So that's the first story. I'm like, that is fantastic. That is the best story I've ever read. But wait, there's more, because the next story was 6 years later. Oh, guess what? The FBI had just arrested him because he set the whole thing up. The art courier ended up with the painting and all the money. And I thought, okay, that is the best story I've ever read. Because I thought if I do an art heist, I was going to have to do something complicated, like guys coming out of the ceiling and cutting things in the Louvre, like a Mission Impossible movie. But this plot point was get drunk, get in a cab. I'm like, okay, I can handle that. I can totally do that. So I had Joan, I had her famous parents. And then I had sort of my device to get her to Paris and a way to get her into the art world. But I said that I wanted to cover loss. And I'm not giving anything away. I think a lot of people here have already read the book. But in the book, Joan loses her dad on 9/11. And he's on one of the planes going west. And I remember, again, that sort of idea, like, where do you get your material? We all remember in those days following 9/11, was, I know, particularly dire here, but we got our news from newspapers before Twitter. We used to just wait for newspapers and actual news broadcasts and actual news on the air. And so I can remember reading in the LA Times, like on the 13th, and it was a TV production company, a couple died in 9/11 on the planes. They were the couple that produced Frasier and a whole bunch of other shows, and they had a ton of Emmys. And they were on the front page of the LA Times. And the rest of the bios of the people on the planes were deeper in the paper. And I remember thinking at the time, that is what fame does to you. Like, even on the darkest day in the country, if you have a bunch of Emmys, you end up on the front page of the paper, for better or worse. By all accounts, they were lovely people. I know people that worked for them, and it was a great loss. And obviously they would have preferred to have not been in the paper at all for that. But it said a lot to me about what fame gives you. And so I tried to incorporate that, and I kind of held on to that nugget for like 20 years. I thought at some point I'm going to use that. I don't know how, but in my book, you'll see Joan's dad dies on 9/11, and his obituary ends up on the front page of newspapers. And that is part of her story, and it's part of her mom's story, and it's part of his story. So that's how I sort of weave those elements together. And then I'm like, moving along. Now it's time. I have all those things I've outlined. It's time to write the book. And you would think, boy, Lian, you're that far along. That book must have written itself. You know what? They never write themselves. They never write themselves. But this book took me 9 years to write. So, which I don't recommend. It's not my usual timeline, but this is where you can't really control everything. I was writing a book, about loss, and I started it only months after I had lost both my parents. My mom died in November of 2012, and my dad died 8 weeks later in February of 2012. And it was, and when it happened, like, I just kept going. I didn't know how to process that at all. My dad had Alzheimer's, so it had been a long journey. My mom had a very quick battle with cancer, equally terrible. But I had a new book coming out. I had Elizabeth I coming out. I was at a book event 5 days after my dad died. I just had to keep moving. And then I thought, I'll get through all these book events. I don't get through the summer. And then in the fall, I'll start my new book. I was just in a lot of denial. And I started and I put together some of the stuff I just told you in Lost and Found in Paris. And on the first anniversary of my dad's death, I just hit a wall. I could not move forward. And I realized I can't write a book about loss if I haven't processed my own loss. Like, there's no possible way. So I put the book in a desk drawer for a couple of years. I went off and did other things, Satellite Sisters. I wrote a whole other book, a collection of essays. I developed a TV show that never sold. See me later if anyone needs it. And then my agent called. She's like, hey, how's it going with that Paris book? I'm like, I guess I got to do that. And I was in a better place, but I still struggled with the writing, and plotting a mystery was new for me. But I eventually got it done. In terms of the business, I wanted to move from a small publishing house to a bigger publishing house. And so that took time. And so my agent found an editor at William Morrow that was really interested in Lost and Found in Paris. I was like, great. And then she said, she's also interested in a 2-book deal. Do you have a book about sisters with a secret? And I was like, I've learned one thing in show business, and it's never say no. I'm like, yes. I have a book about sisters with a secret, of course. And my agent said, in an hour? Because that's when you're talking to Rachel. And I was like, yes, I do. And this is where the 20 years of experience as a professional writer and hosting a daily radio show, we're just pitching and pulling things together. I was like, okay, I got an hour. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm like a professional sister. Basically, that's what I do with my Satellite Sisters. We talk about sisters all the time. We've talked to every expert. We've talked about birth order. Nailed it, sisters. Got it. Okay, what sisters though? And then I remembered the TV show I didn't sell. And that was a book, that was a TV show that I had developed for ABC television, because they said they wanted a show about their Satellite Sisters podcast, which is 5 sisters who live all over the world who do a podcast together. But they said, don't make it about sisters and don't make it about a podcast. Okay, ABC. So I had developed that and it hadn't sold, but I went over to my handy filing system. And for those TV pitches, I pulled it out. The show was called Sweeney Family Rules, and it was about 6 siblings that lived in and around the New York area, like we did when we had first all graduated from college, sort of interacting with people's lives, interacting with each other's lives. So that didn't sell. But when I had pitched that, I had created these goofy table tents as like a visual device. And I know if you've been on some PTA, you know what I'm talking about. Those things in the middle of tables where it's like next month's meeting and please buy the raffle tickets. Okay. So I had developed those for the stars of the show, because all the Sweeneys had red hair. So it's like Emma Stone and just all the redheaded actresses I had put on these goofy table tents. So when I opened the file, they fell out. And I was like, oh my God, the redheaded sisters. Okay. I'm jettisoning the I got 3 sisters. Check. Okay. So, and then I had to find a setting. And I know this about the book business, having lived in California for 30 years, the book business is really biased towards the East Coast. They just don't even understand anything really west of Brooklyn, but certainly west of, like Philadelphia. And so when I first wrote Helen of Pasadena, an editor at St. Martin said to me, well, if it was Helen of Greenwich, but no one's ever heard of Pasadena. I was like, except that literally the billion people that watch that parade, but okey doke, Missy. So I thought, all right, I'm going to set the Sisters with the Secret Book. I grew up in the East Coast. I can set a book in Connecticut like Jane Green. And it's a friend of mine. And so I decided to set it here in my hometown of Southport, Connecticut, because I didn't have time to do research for any other town in Connecticut. So I had the Sisters, the Sweeneys, Southport. And then I also know that book editors love books about books, right? That's just a classic pitch device. And so I was thinking about the influence of Robert Ludlum when we lived here, how he would walk on Southport Beach in his black socks and not talk to anybody and churn out 8 out of the 10 best-selling books of the day, just bestseller after bestseller. So I decided to make the father in that book more of a literary lion, but a writer. And then I needed the secret. And so this is where I have a very active Satellite Sisters Facebook group. And someone had posted a photo of, it was 3 adults. It was like 2 men and a woman. And the caption was just, I met my brother today. Thanks to an over-the-counter DNA test, I just found out I have another brother. I'm not going to tell you the details. But here he is. And, we have the nicest people in the world that listen to Satellite Sisters. So all their comments were like, yay, oh, that's wonderful, heart emoji. And of course, I'm the youngest of 8, and I'm thinking, that sounds terrible. Oh my God, I would hate it if another sibling showed up. The last thing I need is someone else at the Thanksgiving table to deal with. I just thought that sounded awful. So I thought, okay, there's my secret, like secret sibling. So I have, the Sisters, the Sweeneys, Southport, the writer, the secret family. And that's what I took to pitch, and they bought it right away. I had like 3 more days to develop it, and they bought both books, Lost and Found in Paris and the Sweeney Sisters. And this is a long way around, but then the editor said, we'd like to bring out the Sweeney Sisters first. So I was like, I have an entire book written already, but okay. So then I had to put Lost and Found in Paris aside, and I had to just buckle down on the Sweeney Sisters. And so I cranked it out in a year, which is a much better timeline than 9. And I was excited about the book. The publisher was excited about the book. I really enjoyed coming back to Southport and doing some recon and remembering things and hiding secret Easter eggs in there for people who are from Southport and thinly veiling things. No follow-up questions on that. And I was just excited. I loved the cover, and I was excited for the whole publication of it. And then I got cancer. And literally like the day we had approved all the manuscripts and everything was going up on Amazon, I got a call from my doctor that I had an unexpected case of colon cancer. I had gone for a routine colonoscopy. I didn't have any symptoms. We don't have a history of it in my family. And so when they called and told me, I was shocked. So I'd like to interrupt this talk just for a PSA to please get your colonoscopies because that is what saved my life. I had stage 1 colon cancer, and I was operated on, and I recovered well. I'm grateful for good medical care, and I feel great today and remain cancer free. Thank you. Thank you. So I was ready to hit the road with the Sweeney Sisters, and that was April 2020. Remember that? So I had a 10-city tour planned. And of course, the pandemic stopped many things for many people, including my book tour. And at the time when the book came out, every bookstore in America was closed and Amazon wasn't shipping books. Again, don't recommend that either. I would not use that for your book launch. But by the time I actually got back to Lost and Found in Paris, I was 8 years from writing that book, 2.5 years from selling it. It was last summer in 2021 when my editor finally gave me the editor's note, and I had to go back in and make the changes that she wanted. I hadn't even read the book in over 2 years. She hadn't read the book. We had to both reread it. But it was an extraordinary experience because I had written a book that I hope is funny and sexy and romantic and takes you to Paris, but it's also a book with an undercurrent of loss and it's about a very public loss and how people privately dealt with that. And all of a sudden we were in the middle of this now I'm looking at Mrs. Flynn, I'm gonna cry. This is where I usually cry in the speech, but we were all dealing with that and once again on a national level with COVID. You know, there was this giant loss happening and people were dealing with it individually. And I tried to really tap into that when I did the rewrites. I think the book ended up being more profound and deeper and just different because now I had this whole new perspective. I know there are people in this room that probably lost people they loved, and I'm so sorry for that. You know, family members, coworkers, friends, we all lost something. We lost vacations of a lifetime and anniversaries and weddings we didn't get to go to and holidays that got pushed and graduations. It was just a series of losses. I can honestly say the only thing I gained was the sourdough 15. I mean, I didn't even bake the bread. I just ate the bread, which is really stupid. At one point during the pandemic, I had a sourdough dealer that I found on Instagram. It was a source named, the handle was Walrus and the Hedgehog. And I would just DM Walrus or Hedgehog, and they would deliver a loaf of hot sourdough to my front door every Saturday morning. No contact. And after like 6 months, my husband was like, we have to stop with the sourdough for the sake of the children. But when I think of that time, you know, that is sort of the only sort of funny moment. As we have come out of the pandemic, I think some people have jumped back into their lives, and that's admirable. But I think about the time period it took me to get over the loss of my parents. I think loss is something we can't really define in terms of you should be over it right now or let's move on. And I certainly learned that, you know, living through my parents and writing that book and taking a look at loss on a macro level, that everyone has their own timeline in loss. And sometimes it's 9 minutes and sometimes it's 9 years. I have been so pleased to walk into rooms again, to do live events. I love doing them. When my book came out in April, I did something like 30 events in 21 days. It was just, you know, there were all these articles like, are people going to remember how to talk to one another? Oh, they do. Yeah, they totally remember how to talk to one another. They totally remember how to drink white wine at lunch. No problem. People have not forgotten. But it was just such a sense of connection that really touched me. Every time I went, there was such joy in the rooms, and I'm happy to see everybody here. I feel like I'm a little 6 months late on this, but I think as we move further and further away or allegedly back into normalcy, people are still coping on different levels. And I want to say that I understand. If that's you, I understand what you're going through. After I got cancer, I started to use the motto, the personal motto for myself, happy to be here. Right? When someone said, how are you doing? I would just say, happy to be here. Because I was, yeah. So I am happy to be here at the Pequot Library with all of you. Thank you for coming here. Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about my writing or work or the podcast or anything. Oh, yes, in the back, my friend from high school, Liz. Where do I? Full credit to the blowout bar down the street there. Thank you. I told Liz a story today when we were getting our hair blown out. I said, once I did this really fancy author's lunch in Santa Barbara, it's called the Celebrity Author's Lunch. And like Tim Conway was there. So I was sitting like this far from Carol Burnett, which could be the most like terrifying experience, scarier than dancing school. Carol Burnett. And it's a room of 300 people. And the first question was, hi, where do you get your hair done? I was like, well, this is a really literary crowd. I feel like I'm in good shape here to be able to handle this. Thank you, Liz. Besides that deep question, are there any other questions? Oh, Oh, the next book. Okay, Susie Olson, thank you. So I just turned the first draft of the next book in. I signed another 2-book deal with William Morrow last spring. So I have 2 more books coming up. Thank you. Yay. Hey, I'm happy to be employed at this stage of my life. So yay. So the next book is called, I wanted to write a book about my generation, Gen X, and I wanted to write a book about long-term marriage because I think that is something, I mean, I'm guilty of it too. Like my husband's in my books, they're dead, they're awful, they're divorced, like they're not great. Like things aren't going well for some of my main characters. So I wanted to try to write an interesting story about a long-term marriage, as opposed to like my marriage. I like my husband, we've been married 30 years, but no one wants to read about us sitting on the couch watching British murder mysteries. Like that is not an interesting book, and doing some gardening on Saturday. So my next book is called The Marriage Sabbatical. And it's about a couple that, yes, sign me up, right? I know some of you, whatever that is, I want in. So it's about a couple that they have an opportunity. He has a work sabbatical coming up after 25 years at his company. Their kids are on their junior year abroad. They have a chance to go like do this adventure in South America. And at the last minute, the wife's like, yeah, I don't really want to go to South America and ride motorcycles to the end of the earth. It's so windy there. And it is. I heard it's very windy there. So they decide to take separate sabbaticals, separate 9 months off. But, you know, you have to kind of raise the stakes, as we like to say in the fiction business. So they make some rules and some bargains, and they decide all bets are up. Anything you want to do in 9 months, see you later. So, oh yeah, now people are really in. And also, I saw you nod over there. Yes, all bets. So that is the book. So that's turned in, and then I'll get some notes back from my editor and have a couple more months to polish it up, and then that will be out January 2024. Yes. There is a Maggie. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. Sure. So this is a question about Paris research for Lost and Found in Paris. So I had spent a bunch of time in Paris as a student and in my 20s. So when I was studying abroad, I mean, I studied in Athens because I was a classics major, but took trips there, and I had the chance in my 20s. I worked for an international company, and I happened to work in France a lot. So I would go to Paris when I could. But then, you know, life. Then I had kids. They are a drag, man. They take you down. My gosh. And then 14 hours flight from Los Angeles. So it had been like 25 years since I'd been to Paris. And it's an amazing thing how much you can learn on Google, you know? So you know, and I was trying, I think the idea that you get like giant advances to go do research is only true on Sex in the City. Like it doesn't actually happen in the publishing business. So I was trying really hard with this book not to lose money. I just was really working on it. So I thought, well, when I sell it and I get an advance, I'll go and double check. But then it took me, as you heard, 9 years to get it published. But so I wrote it all based on just memory, research, Google. But I also did a lot of things like every expat who lives there has an Instagram account. So I followed a lot of Instagram accounts and got newsletters. And you can look up what was the menu at the hottest restaurant in Paris in 2011. You can look all that stuff up, and you can infuse it and put it in, and to keep looking at the map and making sure I had things right. But then in 2018, when I sold the book, my younger son happened to be studying abroad in Italy. So we met in Paris. And so then before I did the rewrites, I was able to actually do the treasure hunt in the book. Like we went to all the specific places in the book to make sure it tracked, and how many steps are there really up to Sacré-Cœur. And, you know, thank goodness I did it, because like, you can Google Paris, but you can't Google Paris. You know what I mean? So it was really fantastic to go back and take notes. And then when I did the rewrites, to try to infuse that into the book. And my next book, the husband goes to Patagonia, but the wife decides she wants to go to Santa Fe. So I I did it. I took one for the team and I went to Santa Fe for a week in the spring. Again, because I found the research so helpful. And I hadn't been to Santa Fe in like 35 years. And you know what? It's changed. But thank you. Thank you for that question. Yes. Yeah, I mean, yeah. I don't. I don't. You know, that's the yeah, Roland Mouret. So, I mean, that was like the hot dress of that moment in time. So that book is set in 2011. So one of the best, the funnest, is that a word? Things to do is just to like Google historical photos of other things. And like research like that, you can spend hours doing that. You go down a rabbit hole of what would Susie Blakely have ordered from the Neiman Marcus catalog in 2011 and not worn and given to her daughter. And that particular dress, it's like the wrap dress, you know, the other famous wrap, that was like the day version of that dress. That dress was particularly you know, on point for that time. So I could have, there were some on Poshmark. They were all like size 0, and I think I've already explained the sourdough situation. So I did not order. I almost ordered one. I'm like, why? Well, why would I do that to myself? I cannot fit into that dress for the book tour, but that's, and I love details like that. Those are super fun things, because a little thing like that, if you get it right, it really just, you don't need to over explain. It sets the tone. It may be a reference not everybody gets, but for the people who get it, they will appreciate it. So I try to put a few of those, not pack it so it's wall to wall name dropping and stuff, but every once in a while when you can stick one of those in, it's a pretty effective tool in terms of setting this, being character revealing. You want it to reveal character. This is an excellent question from you, Liz. Deep dive, extra credit for Liz. Are there any other questions? Okay, I thank you again. I can't tell you what it's like to see people I've known my whole life here in this room. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.